Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Bert, for sharing about Laity Sunday, which we'll celebrate again in January. But I just want to say, how could we ever function? How could I ever function without everybody in this room who does so much to make our church a welcoming and wonderful and meaningful place? And so I'm grateful for the ministry that we do together. This series that we're doing called Spiritual Awakening, it's not stolen, but inspired by a book called Christianity After Religion, which is a study that we're doing in our adult Sunday school class, looking at, it's kind of like taking the spiritual pulse of what's going on in our church, in our culture, and in churches in our nation. So we've been looking at that, the spiritual pulse, not of just believers, but of spiritual seekers among us. And I begin with a story. It's a personal story. My mother-in-law is in town. Okay, she's staying for a week. And we've been talking about, I've been in the family for 24 years. That's a lot of time. And so we were talking about some of our shared stories together. And it used to be a family tradition back in Pennsylvania that for special occasions we would all gather at Grammy and Grandpa's house. And that's what I even called them, Grammy and Grandpa. They were the patriarch and the matriarch of my husband's family. And they owned a large piece of property in upstate Pennsylvania. And so we would gather here on these acres of land in their house. All the cousins, all the grandkids would get together. Now, a little bit about Grandpa. He had two careers. One, he worked in the Army and worked his way up to colonel. So he was a colonel in the Army, and when he retired from that, he started a whole nother career working for the National Park Service. And it was through that experience that he came to love and be very good at his job of taking care of the land and the environment and being very conscious about the environment. So when we went and gathered at Grammy and Grandpa's farm or their property, there was a lot of care taken to the land. There was a pond, there was a walking trail, there was an orchard, and there was a field that would burst into bloom with daffodils every spring. It was beautiful, and we have a lot of good memories of gathering on that property. Sometimes we would camp there. And one morning, the cousins all woke up after an evening of camping, and we noticed that the bird feeder was completely bent over because a bear had come through and knocked over that bird feeder. So just to give you a picture of the place, turkeys, bears, all kinds of things wandering around. Well, when Grandpa got to be about 90, that's about time he said, I'm getting a little tired of taking care of all this property. And he and Grammy decided to move to a smaller place. And so the questions began, well, what happens to this beautiful place? We have all these memories. Well, there were some of us that would come to the property and mow. There were some of us that could maybe chop some wood. But there were some of us who didn't even like bugs. And so that wasn't really for us. There were some of the teenagers who would come by, the cousins, and they would dredge out the pond from time to time, but then they would be busy and not have time for that either. And so there wasn't among us in the whole family an apprentice, somebody who cared as much, I guess, or knew as much as Grandpa about this property. Well, in this series, again, we've been exploring trends in church. And Diana says this. She says, we live in a time where it is not as common for children to inherit the family business or to inherit the family ways. We live in a time where it's also true that it's not as common for people to inherit the family religion. And so even if you grew up in a family of a certain faith, you, as a spiritual seeker, you may be seeking in other places. I don't know, maybe this is true for you. Maybe in your family or your grandparents, you had a family business that you did not care to inherit. Perhaps you grew up in another faith tradition, Presbyterian or Catholic or Baptist or nothing. Maybe you grew up differently too. Well, one thing hasn't changed, though, that we are humans who are wired intellectually, physically, emotionally, but also spiritually. That's part of how we're wired. And so, people are still spiritually seeking, even though perhaps they're not going to the same places in their search. We live in an age where many people, some who go to church and many who do not, are spiritually seeking, but they just don't feel a connection. They're not feeling a connection with the religion of their parents or their grandparents. Or if they did grow up into the church, they just might not, or if they didn't, they might not feel drawn to organized religion anyway. And in fact, some people who have no experience or little experience or different experiences feel disillusioned by the church, and that's what keeps them away. We talked about that a little bit in our adult Sunday school class today. We talked about things like different fractions with money keep people away. Different fractions with power drive people away. Politics, this feeling of a heavy political environment, drives people away. Rules, too many rules drive people away. And then someone in the class very wisely said, people don't always leave because of Jesus necessarily. It's the relationships. It's when the relationships become rocky or so forth or fractious that people leave or do not come in the first place. So this shift of spiritual seekers, but people who are not necessarily coming back to the faith of their parents, is causing changes in the greater church and in the local church. And some of these changes might seem a little bleak. Attendance maybe not being as strong, or participation not being as good. But Diana points it out this way, that it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for the church to take its own spiritual pulse and to really awaken to what's going on, where God is already moving in the world and moving in the lives of spiritual seekers everywhere. She names this as a time of awakening. Well, let's take that word for a moment. When I go to sleep, I'm not thinking about anything, right? I'm dreaming and I'm drifting and a million other things. And when I wake up, sometimes I feel like my back hurts or my head or something like that. It takes me a little bit longer than it used to get moving in the morning. But when you're finally awake, you have that cup of coffee and you look out the window, often in California it's sunny, you feel revigorized, right? You feel energized again. So I think that's a great word to use. Spiritual awakening, a time for transformation that affects people in this room, but maybe affects a whole culture. So what does God intend to awaken in all of us? I shared this last week, but I'll kind of recap it again. Diana Butler-Bass is also a professor and a teacher, and she was teaching a class on religion with a group of 18-year-olds once. And the students in that class weren't asking these questions. They were not asking, what are the steps I need to do to be a better Christian? Or tell me how to get it right? Or even tell me what I need to learn to pass the test for this course. They weren't asking any of those questions. Instead, they were asking, they were saying, show me a path. Can you show me a path that will transform my life? And that's the difference of some of the spiritual seekers out here. Tell me a path that will make a difference and change my life. If your set of beliefs doesn't change my life, and this week we're going to look at practices, if your practices and the way you do things doesn't change my life, then I really don't have any interest in those things, is what seems to be the pulse of people out in the world, and perhaps even in this room right now. How can we be awakened to this? Awakened from our view as God as a set of propositions, or awakened from the view of God as something we recite out of a creed. Or this week, How can be awakened to a set of rules or a set of rituals that we do? How can be awakened to a new encounter with God? Which brings us finally back to our text, back to this picture in Acts. Sometimes people will look at this and say, oh, for a moment, the church was perfect, right? And in fact, by the way, you don't notice there's no minister in that story about the early church, right? It's the people. It's the lady coming together. And what are they doing? The most basic things. They're praying. They're sharing in communion. They're sharing in meals together. People are joining, so they're obviously welcoming strangers every week. And they're doing these very simple, basic things. Sharing a meal, sharing possessions, being generous. And in this, they were encountering God, and they were being awakened, right? Awakened to a new experience of God. And it was happening in community, together in community. So the pulse is, show me a path. Show me a path to transform my life. Not what are 4 steps to be right with God. That's an external thing. But an internal thing is to show me a path. And that's what we see here in Acts. People coming together, sharing the bread, welcoming the stranger, and enacting together, showing and leading the way together how to have an experience of God. When we talk about practices for believers, and if you're in this room, you've probably been a believer for a while, we can ask, how do the practices that we do, our prayers, our hymns, our hospitality, our sense of justice in the world, how are our practice, or even simple things like lighting the candles, our rituals that we do here in the church, how do these change my life? How do these have the power to influence and change my life in meaningful ways? And then for folks who are seekers, what practices, they're saying, what practices draw my spiritual attention, draw me into a closer understanding of something greater than myself? And I've asked this question, what if I, even now, you can ask yourself too, really started to devote myself more seriously and in a more meaningful way to even one of these practices? How would it change and shape my life from here forward, my path, and my understanding and experience of God? As followers, we're to what? We're to love God and love each other. So simple, right? And loving God means this. We can look at the practices this way: devotion, prayer, meditation, the reading of Scripture are practices like communion and baptism together. If you were to pick one of those to get really serious about, how would it change your life? How would it change my life? And then there are the practices of loving one another that we do in community, and that is our sense of justice, hospitality, the way we practice compassion, our engagement with people around the world. These are our practices of loving the neighbor, even neighbors beyond our neighborhood. How does attention to that, or how has it changed your life? Dr. Bass, she distinguishes between practices, which is what we're trying to focus on, and programs. I know in my experience, my husband was a program director once. That was his title. He was to come into church and to start programs for the church. But a program can be very effective. It can. It can be a great gateway into learning something new or having a spark fired inside of you. Maybe you come together for a program, 6 weeks on how to pray, or 6 weeks on how to be more hospitable. Those are still great. But a program is a short-term thing, right? A short-term learning experience, where Diana is pointing to something bigger, this idea of practice. And practice can take hours and hours, right? It's about mastery, not learning something new, but mastery of something. I was watching you today, and Ben was playing the drums. I was thinking about, sorry not to point you out, but my son plays the drums, and he started playing the drums when he was in the 4th grade. Every week I drove that kid to lessons. Every week I waited for him for an hour while he practiced one-on-one with his teacher. And over time, he got better and better, right? It started off from him sitting around in the kitchen, banging on things with a fork and a knife, to him being able to play a whole giant set of drums and being able to play other music like jazz and rock and roll and orchestra music, so forth. But I think of all the hours and hours and hours of practice that it took for him to get to that level. I think about Grandpa. Grandpa didn't learn those skills overnight of how to take care of an orchard or how to maintain a pond. Hours and hours of practice devoted to those things. Mastery. I don't know if you've read the book Outliers, and if you haven't, it's okay. But in that book, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the idea, there's an idea out there, it may or may not be completely true, but the idea that it takes to master a skill, to completely master it, it takes about 10,000 hours of practice. That's 20 hours a week for, all the weeks of the year for 10 years to master a skill. Now, I think you're going to need a little talent first, perhaps, depending on what your skill is. But you get the idea. Hours and hours and hours to be the best. How many hours does it take to be a better Christian? That's not really the question. It's a spiritual thing, right? How many hours can we devote, or how much time does it take? And is it worth the time to have a more meaningful experience and encounter with God? We are in an age where people are spiritually seeking, but maybe they're burnt out, or they're not going to church at all, or they're apathetic. And so where are these practices cultivated? Where are they happening? Religion, or practices together, used to be shared in the same way as learning a family trade. You would come alongside your mother or your father, and you would learn that skill until you were a proficient and a master of that skill as well. You didn't totally learn it on your own. You learned from a mentor or a parent or a very good teacher. And in church, this is the place, right? This is the place where we learn and encourage those practices together. But if you're not here, how do you know? Somebody asked the question this morning. It was actually a question posed by a friend. Do I even need to? Do I need to go to church? And the answer is, well, church is a place. It is a place where these greater spiritual practices are learned and taught. And as we work out the process of being disciples, walking with one another. Diana shares this story. Well, first of all, 2 elements to learning these spiritual practices. Time being one of them, lots of time. And then also a good teacher, which again can happen in community together. Diana shares an experience, though, of being in a church. And it was known that she was very good at arranging flowers. This had been actually the family business, arranging flowers. That was her talent. So someone in the church who was in charge of making sure the altar was complete and ready for worship every week by putting out the special linens, by putting out the special flowers, putting out the special candles, making sure there was enough oil for the candles, and making sure the communion elements were all there. Ah, yes, it's laity in the church that does all of those things. But this person who had been in charge of this for many, many years came to Diana and said, would you be willing to join the altar guild or to help with the altar arrangements? And Diana responded with this question: why? Why should I do this? And the response was, well, I've been doing it forever, and I'm really sick of it. So do you think Diana said yes? Would you? Doesn't sound very inviting, does it? She relates what it would have been like if the person had said, here's why. Because it's inviting. Because we want to create a welcoming table, just as God welcomes us. We want people to see that reflected in the table. Because communion is such an important part of who we are as Christians. When we come to this table, we know that we have grace. We experience forgiveness. We have an encounter with God. When we arrange the flowers just so, it's a celebration. It reminds us that we're here to celebrate as Christians and in fellowship together. If she had responded that way, yeah, sign me up. That's an experience, right? And what if the person had gone even further and said, I'm not just going to leave you to do it. I will walk with you for a while. And I will tell you how it's meant a lot to my life. And I would love for it to mean something to your life too. There are people in this church with many different talents in teaching, in doing the things that make our church beautiful, in hospitality, in justice, in so many areas I can't even name. And it's part of our work, right, to invite others to come alongside, not because we're tired and burnt out, although we might be, but because it has meaning, and it's an experience, right? It's a place for people to experience God in their lives as they do these practices. Diana says this: what if the church were more like a guild, right? A guild is where you learn something like pottery guild or carpentry. What if the church was like that, a workshop with many teachers, not just one, many teachers, where we learn the things of faith, not because we have to do them, but because of the why behind them, the great why behind them. And I won't end today, Ari, on Let It Be So. I will end with two questions. One is not to be overwhelmed by all these things. How can I be better at prayer or Bible study? That leads to programs again, right? We get anxious, and so we start a program to be better at this. But rather, what can you individually, what is one practice that I can strengthen myself in, commit myself to with time, or perhaps seeking out a teacher who is willing to partner beside me? And then this: how would it be different as a church if we committed strongly to a practice we're already good at, or to finding something new that we could be stronger at that would serve our community? How would it be different? How would it be different? Amen. Amen.